Welcome, everybody, to episode 32 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn. I'm joined, as always, by my colleague, Bill Roggio. Bill, say hi to the audience.
Hello, everyone.
We are senior fellows at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the editors of FDD's Long War Journal. This week, we are honored to be joined by H.R. McMaster. He's our special guest this week. He was, of course, the National Security Advisor for President Trump from early 2017 to the spring of 2018. He is probably best known for that role, but he has a long record of service to his country before then. He graduated from West Point, led troops in combat during multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He served during the first Gulf War and during the post-9/11 wars, and eventually became a three-star general. In addition to being a soldier, he is a scholar. He is the author of Dereliction of Duty, a deeply researched book that looks at the failures of leadership and decision-making during the Vietnam War. Bill, I know you and I are big fans of that book long before we met General McMaster. Hopefully we can talk a little bit about that today.
Absolutely.
And most recently, he's the author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. General McMaster decided to take on every possible national security challenge America faces today in one book. We'll talk about what possessed him to do that. And he is the chairman of the Board of Advisors at the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which, of course, also employs us. General, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Tom, great to be with you and Bill. Thanks for this podcast and what you do to inform Americans about the challenges we face. It's a real privilege to be with you.
No, the honor is all ours. You know, before we dive into sort of the nerdy details, the wonky stuff and policy stuff, let's get into a little bit about your background. You're a Philly guy like Bill, aren't you?
I am, right there at the center of the universe, right there in Philadelphia.
Does that make you an Eagles fan like Bill then? Does it mean I got two Eagles fans and myself?
Hey, I mean, season tickets in our family for the Eagles, going back to the 30s, so, tailgates are a 2-meal event with my cousin and his RV that he brings. I mean, I'd say we qualify as Eagles fans. And my hero of all time is obviously Chuck Bednarik, who I actually got to know when I was a child, and corresponded with him off and on until he passed away, sadly, a few years ago.
Yeah, Concrete Charlie, definitely a classic Eagle. Absolutely great taste. His passing was sad.
Well, actually, the Eagles, just so our listeners know, the Eagles are sort of the bane of my existence because I am the lone Giants fan on this podcast, being a New Yorker. I come from a long family of Giants fans. My father, the last game of his life was Super Bowl 42 against the Patriots, and he used to say to us as kids, boys, there's only two things I want from you in this world. One, don't ever root for the Dallas Cowboys. And two, don't do drugs. And then he would say, and not necessarily in that order, So
as Philly fans, Tom, we can understand that.
One of my mom's brothers, moved to this other country called New Jersey. and moved into northern Jersey, and they became Giants fans. It was really, it was at risk of ostracizing that branch of the family. But we come together periodically. The Rangers fans too,
I'm a Rangers fan as well, although we're turning the corner there now. But let's not get into my suffering as a sports fan of the moment. You guys, looks like you guys are going to win the division here in the NFC East this year by default. Bill, you want to get into a little bit of the general's background a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, as Homer Simpson said, the two greatest words in the English language are default. And I think that's where our Eagles will be this year, I hope, anyway. If not, they really are the bottom of the basement. And Tom, I've known you for a long time, and I have tolerated you even as being a Giants fan. I don't hold it against you. General, what year did you graduate West Point?
1984.
And how did you do there? Where did you graduate in your class?
Well, I was okay academically, but I was misunderstood and a victim of circumstance sometimes from the perspective of the commandant and the disciplinary aspect of being a cadet. But I made it through, and was commissioned in aviation, but then found astigmatism in my eye and I became an armor officer.
Armor, excellent. Yes. And, look, for those of you who are not familiar with the general's career, one of his, in the first Gulf War, Battle of 73 Easting, you certainly, you commanded Eagle Troop. Am I correct? Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So you took on Saddam Hussein's army. You took on basically, 2 brigades of the Republican Guards during that battle. Can you tell us about that? Tell us just a little bit. How did that feel? What was that like leading men? You were a captain, right? A troop captain. What did you think of the Iraqi army? Just give us a little flavor of what it was like to go to battle against the Iraqis, and then we had to do it another decade later, and then we fought an insurgency there. It's your history in Iraq is long.
Well, I'm really proud of what our cavalry troop achieved there. A military unit takes on the quality of a family, under shared hardships and tough training, and then certainly in combat. And the key is to train hard and to demand the highest standards of a unit so that they're ready for war, and that they have the confidence, right? Confidence in their weapon systems and ability to fight as individual soldiers, but really confidence as a team. And our team really, I think, was extraordinary. And we did have a high degree of confidence. And on the 26th of February of 1991, we were at the so-called tip of the spear, as we were part of the envelopment attack against the Republican Guard, with the mission of destroying the Republican Guard, and then continuing the attack into Kuwait to free Kuwait, turn Kuwait back to the Kuwaitis. Right, Saddam had invaded the previous August and declared Kuwait its 19th province, and so it was the day that we were moving toward the Republican Guard defenses. The day started, it was pouring rain all night. It's desert. I was thinking, this is a desert. Why are we all so in the rain all the time? But the next morning, fog set in, really heavy fog because of the rain. But then as the fog dissipated, the wind kicked up, and then we were in a sandstorm. And so, visibility was limited. Our helicopters were grounded. And our cavalry troop, along with G Troop of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 2nd Squadron, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, were moving toward the east, toward these Republican Guard defenses. And our regiment was trying to control our movement, because our job as a scout unit or reconnaissance unit, now a pretty powerful one. Our cavalry troop had 9 Abrams tanks and 12 Bradleys and mortars, but our job was to find the enemy, find where the enemy was weak, find where the enemy is strong, isolate strength, and then pull the heavy divisions behind us into battle under advantageous conditions. Well, we had some initial contact around the 6-7 north-south grid line, some reconnaissance elements which we destroyed pretty quickly, and then we got permission to continue our movement to the 7-0 easting. I was a little bit frustrated by the halting nature of our movement, but I just got a sense in my gut, Bill, hey, we're about to run into something here. So I made the decision to change our formation, to take the Bradleys, the scout platoons, and tuck them in behind the tanks. And then our tanks move forward in a 9-tank wedge, with my tank at the center of that wedge, 1 tank platoon in echelon to my right, 1 echelon to my left. And what we didn't realize is that we were crossing a very subtle ridge line. It was so subtle that when you looked out, it looked like just flat terrain. But as my tank came over that ridge line, I saw immediately 8 enemy tanks in dug-in defensive positions right to my front at, what is kind of knife fight range for tanks, about 1,000 meters. And 2 of those tanks engaged my tank and missed as we began to engage. Also, our scout platoon to the far north picked up a hot spot of an enemy vehicle, engaged that with a tow anti-tank missile. The battle started, and then we went into an assault against this enemy. Our tank crew destroyed the first 3 tanks in about 10 seconds, and then assaulted through a minefield. And then as the other 8 tanks came over, they all engaged different targets. We trained this way. It's called fire distribution, right? And so we took out a huge part of the enemy quickly, which gave us a physical advantage, but it also gave us a tremendous psychological advantage, right? Because now you have these 60-ton tank killing machines coming at you, right? And it was at that point where my executive officer called me and said, hey, you're at the limit of advance. And I said, hey, just tell them we can't stop. I'm sorry, we have to, it's like if it's in a boxing match, you land your jab, the right, you got to follow with the right, and so we continued the assault for about 3.5 kilometers, and we stopped after another ridge line. I think it was fortunate that we continued to attack. The enemy, as a result, couldn't recover from the initial blows. We entered their reserve position on top of the second ridge line about 4 kilometers later and destroyed 17 additional T-72 tanks. Overall, our troop was able to destroy over 50 armored vehicles, close to 60 armored vehicles. And then we stopped, when we had nothing left to shoot, essentially. And it took 23 minutes. And there was still sporadic contact through the night. Into the next morning, we took large numbers of prisoners that night. The battle wasn't over, but we were very fortunate to really experience a lopsided victory and suffer no casualties ourselves. So extremely proud of our troopers, and I've been talking to our troops afterwards. And I wrote this in an account that I wrote like the next day. I wrote an account on a legal pad, just to remember it. And it's published on the Fort Benning website, I think. But I recall, just talking to our soldiers afterwards, and they said, it just kind of came natural to us. And thank God we did all this hard training. It really paid off. And so, that was our experience in battle in Iraq. And then we wound up in Ur of the Chaldees, Abraham's birthplace, right by Talil Air Base. And it was there that, our cavalry troop was astride, the 6-lane highway that leads to Baghdad, what then became Route Tampa, right? And there's a sign, Baghdad, X number of kilometers. I'm like, wait, why don't we just go to Baghdad? That's where Saddam is. Why don't we just finish the job? And then as I met with Iraqis and different sheikhs in the tribal areas of the South, I realized how fragmented and fractious Iraqi society had become. And I started to think about it and thought, if we get rid of Saddam, it's not going to get rid of the violence. There's probably going to be an insurgency associated with the Ba'ath Party. And then obviously getting rid of Saddam, how do we forge a government that comes after? It's going to be complicated. And Bill, when I came back from Iraq, I wrote an op-ed for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the title was "Why the U.S. Was Right in Not Taking Over All of Iraq." And the reason that I gave was that it would be a long-term commitment with probably no end in sight and no guarantee of success, right? And of course, that's the situation we found ourselves in after 2003. But I think that we debate the wrong question about 2003. Like we always debate, hey, should we have done it? I think we should debate who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy? And that's the story I try to tell in Battlegrounds, is a story of not really being prepared for the need to consolidate military gains and get to a sustainable political outcome in Iraq.
Absolutely. And General, I had enlisted in, I believe it was in January of 1991. So I was actually in either basic training or AIT when you guys went in. So, but the Second Armored Cavalry Regiment there, your actions were legendary within the military. People were talking about that for years while I was in. So I appreciate that. Appreciate you sharing that story. It's just fantastic. And you're right. I mean, our troops train better than anyone. And for whatever faults we may have, our enemy's faults are legion. And we overcome it with fantastic training.
And just just how courageous our troopers were. A driver is a tank driver. That's a tough spot to be in, right? Because you're not actively shooting at the enemy. Actually, shooting at the enemy is a great comfort psychologically, right? You're engaged in that fight, but your driver's just looking at this large enemy formation and driving toward it, driving through a minefield. And my driver, Chris Hedenskog, but all the drivers in the troop just were, and all of the soldiers, they didn't hesitate. They did their duty, and they performed, I think, with great courage and distinction in that fight. I was just proud to be one member of that team.
I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here on our little outline, but, we kind of freestyle a little bit on our podcast. So you said something I think is worth exploring a little bit here, which is, you saw early on the potential for insurgency to engulf Iraq. Of course, that led to what's now widely decried as these endless wars. It's one of the wars. It's part of the sort of the endless wars mantra. Some of that, we've talked about a lot on this podcast, and some of that's because of American missteps, like the removal of Saddam. Other factors are because the enemy gets a vote, and because a lot of these situations are complicated, and it's not clear cut all every time. There's definitely a rising sort of course. People just want to pin all the blame on the U.S. now for all these sort of ills. But I was wondering if you could explore a little bit, what you're talking about when you talk about this tank battle. You have a moment of decisive sort of Jacksonian victory, which seems to be there's one current of the American psyche that sort of desires that sort of Jacksonian sort of moment to say, hey, aha, we won, we defeated you, now we can go home. And it seems to me that a big part of the problem we face in the post 9/11 conflicts is that we entered a couple different conflicts that you're not going to have that Jacksonian moment. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the sort of how you see that, or how you view that, or if you think I'm off base, or what your views are on that.
No, Tom, I think you're really hitting an important point here. And I think what happened is we learned the wrong lessons from the 1991 Gulf War and those lopsided victories, right? So in the introduction of Battlegrounds, I talk about the opportunity I had as a captain in our army to witness the end of the Cold War, right? Our cavalry regiment was patrolling the East German, West German, and the West German Czechoslovakian border when East Germany lifted travel restrictions to the West. And so we saw the Iron Curtain part. The wall came down. The East German government faded away. The Soviet Union collapsed. Right, we won the Cold War, and then after that, we won the Gulf War in a decisive military victory over the fourth largest army in the world. I think what happened is that bolstered our confidence, and that confidence became overconfidence and led to complacency. Complacency based, I think, on three overlapping assumptions about this post-Cold War world. First among them was that that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. And secondly, that great power competition was a relic of the past. And third, and this is really associated more with the Gulf War, that our technological military prowess would guarantee our security. And if any force had the temerity to challenge us, that war would be waged quickly, decisively, efficiently, and mainly from standoff range, right? And then, of course, that was a setup, right? It was all a setup in part for the strategic shock of 9/11, when a brutal, determined enemy used box cutters and airplanes to commit the most devastating terrorist attack in history, bypassing right our technological military prowess. Tom, I think today you see a lot of these same kind of assumptions about future war gaining traction again, right? And so, of course, the Gulf War was a lopsided outcome for two reasons. First of all, his army fought hard, but they were not a capable force because they were stuck in the war between 1980 and 1988 with the Iranians, right? They weren't ready for an armored cavalry troop. I mean, it blew their minds, in terms of time-space relationships and the way that they set up their defense and so forth. But the second reason was a narrowly circumscribed political objective. Hey, give Kuwait back to the Kuwaitis. That was it, right? Now, we had to contain Saddam after that. So people forget there was a sustained commitment there. But I think what that led to this idea of easy war, right? A small footprint military operations. And we forgot, hey, the consolidation of gains in war, it's not a optional phase, right? It's something we've always had to do. And as my friend, the historian Conrad Crane often says, is we have never been able to never do it again. And so what's happening, sadly, I think with the ending endless wars mantra is we're perpetuating the same sets of flawed assumptions that complicated our efforts in both places, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And this idea, that you can take essentially the George Costanza approach to war and just leave on a high note. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, General, one thing, it's we're just unwilling to see these conflicts through. By not pursuing real victory on the battlefield, by leaving an enemy in the field, in the case leaving Saddam, we set ourselves up. I mean, that we're by taking half measures, we're extending these conflicts, and we don't fight. Limited objectives of Iraq had a snowball effect for two decades to the U.S. invasion and overconfidence, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, obviously, I don't have to explain this to you. I find that, that we've lost that mindset from a political leadership standpoint that we're not willing to, we're willing to fight for limited political objectives and think that we're going to actually win in the end when we have enemies that are willing to fight us unconventionally, that are willing to fight extended wars when our civilian base isn't really willing to do that. They don't want to fight extended wars.
Yeah, and we're fighting wars based on the wars we would prefer to fight rather than what the situation demands. And so our strategies in wartime are based on fundamentally flawed assumptions, many of which are implicit and therefore go unchallenged, right? And this is what you and you, Bill, and Tom have done such a great job on, is pulling the curtain back, and showing people, hey, this is the real nature of this enemy. And so, for example, in Afghanistan, we've conjured the enemy we would prefer to fight. And assume that that the Taliban is distinct and there's a bold line between the Taliban and jihadist terrorists. When in fact they're absolutely intertwined. and inseparable in many ways. And so, I think that this is our tendency to define the world, and the wars as we would like them to be. And that's what lengthens these wars, right? It's the short-term mentality that lengthens and complicates the wars and increases the costs associated with them. And I think that we haven't been able to shake it. And what the American people deserve to know, they deserve to know, okay, what is at stake, right? What is at stake in this war? And the second thing they need to know is, what is the strategy? What is the strategy that will deliver an outcome favorable to our interests at a cost that's acceptable? And, I think our leaders have failed across multiple administrations to tell the American people what is at stake, and hey, what is the strategy that's going to deliver an outcome at an acceptable cost. And what frustrated me, and one of the motivating factors to write Battlegrounds, was that in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, I was on the receiving end of these strategies that were based on fantasy in Washington rather than the reality on the ground. And I wanted to write a book that explained why that happens. And the reason that I offer in the book is strategic narcissism, right? The tendency to define the world as we would like it to be, and then assume that whatever we do, whether it's to act or decide not to act, is going to be decisive to achieving a favorable outcome. And of course, Sun Tzu would have told us there's a problem with that, right? Because you have to consider your enemy as well. And so I think that it is this high degree of incompetence strategically that has been the lodestone around our necks, and so the argument in the book is to improve our strategic competence by first applying what the historian Zachary Shore calls strategic empathy, right? To view these complex challenges from the perspective of the other, and in particular, our enemies, our rivals, and our adversaries. We haven't done that. We haven't done that. We didn't do that in 2003 enough in Iraq. We didn't do that in 2001 enough in Afghanistan. We certainly didn't do it in December 2011 when Vice President Biden called up President Obama and said, "Thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war." Well, hey, newsflash, man, wars don't end when one side disengages, right? And then we found that out the hard way when less than 3 years later, ISIS is in control of territory the size of Great Britain and has created maybe the largest humanitarian catastrophe since the end of World War II, right? And we learned it again. We should have learned it again in Libya, right, where the Obama administration, in its effort to avoid what it perceived as the mistakes of the Bush administration, actually exceeded those mistakes by intervening with bombs, not boots, and then doing nothing to shape the political outcome on the back end, right? And look at Libya now; it's still an utter catastrophe, right? And it's the biggest transit point for refugees coming out of the G5 Sahel, and it's been enmeshed in conflict since early 2011. So I just think, we're learning the wrong lessons, Bill and Tom, and you both of you have been a strong voice for administering a corrective to these assumptions. But I think the ending endless wars mantra is prevalent these days.
Yeah, I mean, look, we struggle with this because, if you read Long War Journal through the years, we've been critical of exactly what you said. I mean, you just gave a lot of criticisms yourself that match our criticisms. I mean, it's sort of, if you're, we're going to get into Afghanistan in a few minutes, of course. We'll probably trigger some Taliban apologists with that conversation, but that's what we do. In any event, when you look at sort of the whole history of this, it's very difficult to justify U.S. interventionism abroad when you see the missteps and the problems that have been caused by these wars. I mean, I can't defend the Iraq War, the decision in March 2003 to go to war with the Saddam Hussein's regime. I mean, it's opened up a can of problems, The Afghan War is different because that was a different set of circumstances. I think those two are lumped together now, And you brought up Libya. We had an earlier episode of this podcast with the CIA officer who actually, Sarah Carlson, who actually orchestrated the evacuation of the U.S. from Libya. And, she offers a critique that Bill and I share, which is a lot of times the U.S. officials in Washington and elsewhere can't tell the good guys from the bad guys, and they get all confused about who they're even looking at. In Libya, you had basically American diplomats wanting to side with extremists in Libya, or work with extremists in Libya. It just didn't make any sense, And we see that same confusion is, of course, set in with regard to the Taliban, which we'll talk about. But this all leads to sort of I recall something I heard you say once, General, which is sort of what I sort of have how I kind of frame this in my own mind, which is that, the Bush administration basically overstepped, tried to do too much and went too far in one direction. And then the Obama administration came in running against those policies. And basically the corrective was to try and go too far in the other direction. And it was sort of the point now of steering foreign policy for the United States of America is to find sort of a more balanced sort of approach that's not trying to do too much, but at the same time is not giving up America's position or interests or power in the world, And I think that's a very difficult balancing act. And I don't want to get into it all right yet, but there's some passages and battlegrounds I thought that were very illuminating, I thought, in terms of how to think about that. But I was wondering if, when you look at today, as we go forward, we're at the end of 2020 here, what do you think about the future here in terms of steering foreign policy from that perspective and trying to sort of strike that balance?
Well, I think it comes down to this idea of strategic competence, and in particular, paying attention to the fact that others have a say in the future course of events, right? And I do think that it's a fair criticism of the George W. Bush administration to say that some of the leaders within that administration undervalued or underestimated the risks and costs of action, whereas in the Obama years, that many of the leaders in that administration underestimated the risks and costs of inaction. And so I think what's immensely important is to frame and understand these complex challenges as the first step. Then the second step is the inventory. Okay, what is the so what? Why do we care? What vital interests are at stake? How does this problem set abroad affect our security, affect our prosperity at home? And then after you do that, you're in a position where you can articulate a long-term goal and more specific objectives. But the step you have to take next, is really important, which is to understand limitations on the degree to which you can exercise agency or influence or control, over that situation. And when I say you being able to do that, it's really the United States and like-minded partners working together, right, to overcome that challenge to our security and prosperity. And I don't think that just logical sequence of how to think about complex problems, it's largely absent in government. And what happens is we don't define the problem well. We don't take time to think about the nature of the enemy. Tom, you've written so much about this, and Bill, about we don't understand who we're fighting in Afghanistan, right? How many Americans
all these years later? All these 2 decades later, still don't get it. You can still ask people basic questions and they don't know the answers. Can
you imagine this World War II? Yeah, hey, who we're fighting at? I forgot. It's really so self-referential, right? And if you're self-referential in war, you're going to get your ass kicked, right? Because your enemy is going to continue to adapt and fight you in asymmetric ways. And really, what you have to do is you have to be able to defeat the enemy. How about that for like an old school idea? And when you go to war, you don't go to war just to experience it, right? In fact, for a war to be just, for a war to meet St. Thomas Aquinas's jus ad bellum theory, you have to have a just end in mind, right? And we haven't defined clearly what our objectives are, and then marshaled all of our efforts to be able to accomplish those objectives. And I would say that in Afghanistan, what that requires is defeating the Taliban, which means convincing the Taliban they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of violence. We never did that. And in fact, during the Obama years, we no longer had them as a designated enemy. So they're killing our soldiers. They're committing mass murder against Afghans, and we can't even target them. And that's the situation we're in again now. This is why, we see this an unchecked offensive in large measure in Helmand province in Khost. This is why you see the continuation of these mass murder attacks, most recently at the American University of Afghanistan or in a maternity hospital. So we don't acknowledge the nature of our enemy. We don't understand our enemy, and then we don't make it our objective to win, right? And to win. And if you're not trying to win in war, I would say that not only is that unwise, right, because it gives your enemy the opportunity to continue to adapt and to to impose costs on you, but it's also unjust, I think, to do it, unethical to do it.
Yeah, General. I've never actually written about this or stated this publicly. Tom will know. I've argued for years that I feel like the way we fight war, or it's been immoral, and not for the reasons that people in the anti-war camp would say, but for the exact reasons that you're making here. It's immoral because the way we're fighting them, we're not fighting them to win, which extends these wars, which destroys society with long-term war. It keeps the enemy in the field. It keeps them, and it escalates. Afghanistan's the perfect case. It is a country with zero. After 4 decades of war, us being involved in 19 of them, it's a country with zero infrastructure at this point, and we are complicit in this by allowing the Taliban to hang in this fight. And that's what bothers me. That's what makes it difficult for me to advocate getting involved in the next country. Not because, believe me, I understand our interest. I understand that we have enemies, but when we're fighting them morally, I have some serious concerns about getting involved.
Well, and it has to do with competence and as well, because it relates, right? It relates to being able to pursue a just end and to meet the requirements of ethical requirements of just war theory. No, I think it's, as I mentioned, it's like we don't frame the problem right. We don't the problem of the war properly. We don't understand the enemy, and then as a result, we base our plans and our strategies on the enemy that we would prefer to fight. We engage in a range of activities, but don't understand how those military activities in particular are equating to progress toward accomplishing really what is a sustainable political outcome. In Afghanistan, what's been striking is not only the short-term approach to a long-term problem and the fact that, it's not a 19-year-long war. It's a 1-year war fought 19 times over, right? And we talked about this, Tom, around the time of the development of the South Asia strategy when I was National Security Advisor. I think the only time in Afghanistan where we had a sound policy and strategy in place that could be executed at a cost acceptable to the American people was from 2017 to 2018. And this was the president's announcement of the South Asia strategy in August of 2017. But other than that, we haven't stuck to any approach. And we've gone from a series of flawed assumptions to a series of flawed assumptions under the short-term mentality, but then also just a misunderstanding of the nature of the problem there. And what's bad about this, okay? What's bad about this is not only does it give your enemies the opportunities, right? And we told the Taliban the whole time, hey, we're leaving. We tell the Afghan government we're leaving. And so when you tell them you're leaving, you forget, war is a contest of wills. So the Taliban, all that does is bolster their will. But what happens to Afghans? Afghans look over their shoulder. Who's got my back? Nobody? You're leaving? Okay. Hey, I need to cut some deals with warlords and criminalized patronage networks so I can hedge my bets to make sure that I'm in a place of relative advantage if the situation devolves back to the Civil War period of 1992 to 96, for example. So you encourage activity on the part of your friends that is destructive as well. And of course, neutrals they're just not going to commit one way or the other because they're going to ride it out. They don't know what's going to happen. That's what's happened in Afghanistan. We forgot that war is an extension of politics, right? Clausewitz was right about that. And we forgot that war is human. That people fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. We forget that war is uncertain because of its interactive nature and the fact that the enemy has a say in the future course of events. And if you give them your script, and tell them, hey, this is my timetable for withdrawal of troops, this is what I'm going to do, what I'm not going to do, then that gives them the opportunity to control the future course of events. They're not going to adhere to the script that we give them. And then finally, of course, war is a contest of wills. And what we've done over the years is we have bolstered the will of the Taliban. We've diminished the will of our partners. And I think if the great captains of history were to come back and look at how we've waged these wars, they would think we're incompetent or insane or both.
Let's we got ahead here to the Afghan part, but I knew with the three of us that would probably happen. So it's okay. We'll go forward with it. So you're as National Security Advisor in 2017. You shepherded sort of a new review of the Afghan War. You set in place a number of policies. Of course, President Trump gives a speech on August 21st, 2017, announcing the new South Asia strategy. But, just over a year later, it's obvious that strategy was abandoned by the administration, where, the president and the State Department sort of start pushing ahead with this idea that we're now going to, negotiate with the Taliban and reach some sort of accord with them. Bill and I, as you know, have been very critical of that whole process because we think it's an example exactly what you say of strategic narcissism, of viewing the Taliban as we want to view the Taliban and basically whitewashing them and sort of making things up in order to justify our policy desires. But, from our perspective, the thing we struggle with is that, now obviously we seem to be at the end of the American process here, that in fact, listen, the people who are critical of the war, they have legitimate gripes, as we've come up with. I mean, I think you've given them plenty of legitimate reasons to criticize the war effort, Bill and I certainly have as well. I think what separates us is we're not exactly eager to see the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which they remain allied with today, take over Kabul or take over the country and start exporting terrorism, which is exactly what they're going to do, or at least try to do in terms of conquering ground. What do you think now about going forward? Whether it's a Biden administration, I think that there's no appetite really for the U.S. anymore staying in Afghanistan, or very little to no appetite. And is there anything that can be done to basically prop up the Afghan government as America continues to draw down, or is it fait accompli?
Yeah. I think there's a lot that could be done, but I think what we would have to do is redesignate the Taliban as an enemy force and go after them actively. So it just shows you how crazy the situation's become with this massive offensive in Helmand that's causing a huge displaced person refugee crisis there. So the Taliban can gain control of the narcotics trade and rake in billions of dollars, so they can use those billions of dollars to finance more mass murder attacks against us. Right? That's what's happening. Well, I think that. That they were complaining that, hey, you guys are bombing, you're conducting airstrikes in support of Afghan security forces. And we would have to have a change of policy to declare the Afghan enemy again. And I think that's possible, that we could generate the will to do that. I think what's important about Afghanistan to recognize is that it was at a sustainable level of commitment. I mean, at the time that we started the drawdown, I think it was 11,500 soldiers. I mean, that is a really minuscule number of soldiers. And whereas our brave soldiers are still making sacrifices, we lost 10 of our courageous soldiers this year in Afghanistan. But hey, 30 Afghan soldiers and police give their lives every day, right, to hold on to the freedoms that they've enjoyed since 2001. And I think that's worth supporting, right? And that sustainable level of commitment was going down to like 8,000 troops and probably about. The goal was about 15 billion total a year. That was sustainable, especially when you compare it to the cost of withdrawal. That's what nobody does, right? So withdrawal looks like, hey, this is a great way to save money, save lives, and they also cast it as a way to improve our security. Well, no, it's not going to improve our security because our enemies have agency over the future as well, right? And so what's going to happen? Tom, I mean, who knows how bad the humanitarian catastrophe is going to be, but it's already bad. Where do those refugees go? Hey, they're going to initially go mainly to Pakistan. What's in Pakistan? A global jihadist terrorist, ecosystem, right? That in which these groups, share resources, expertise. That's a great recruiting, pool are from the refugees. And by the way, it could destabilize Pakistan further, a country that has nuclear weapons, and we're not all that confident about how secure the nuclear weapons are, right? So that's kind of bad. Imagine these terrorist organizations having access to the most destructive weapons on earth. That seems like a high stakes game to me. And then what happens psychologically, not only physically to the Afghan people, who, by the way, refugees will also go to Europe and be on a scale that rivals those that went into Europe during the Syrian civil war. In fact, Afghanistan was the second largest source of refugees, even during the height of the Syrian civil war. But then what happens psychologically, Tom? When the black flag of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is flying over Kabul, and they say, "Hey, look, we just defeated the world's greatest superpower," which is, by the way, what they're saying to our Afghan friends in Doha right now.
Yeah,
when they sit across the table from them, they're saying, "Hey, what are we even talking to you for? We already defeated the world's greatest superpower," right? So I'll tell you, I think this is immensely short-sighted, this withdrawal. And you know what? It's going to make us a lot less safe, man. I mean, and when you talk to these, the retrenchers or the offshore balancers.
Oh yeah, you've just triggered all of them, by the way, with your conversation. Yes, you've triggered all of them. Yeah, no. You'll see a commentary. We see all the commentary. H.R. McMaster, warmonger for Afghanistan, for wanting to, for God forbid he wants to fight the jihadis. So.
Or and prevent another 9/11, right? It's not a theoretical case, right? Yeah. Look at the other threats that have emerged from that region. The attempted Times Square bomber, Why couldn't he get his act together? Because he was dodging our forces in the region when he was in Pakistan, right? I mean, I think that these are the stories the American people don't know. They don't understand what is at stake. And that's why we haven't been able to sustain the will. Hey, I don't blame the retrenchers. I don't blame the American people saying endless wars, because our leaders have failed to explain to them what is at stake and what is a strategy that will keep us safe at an acceptable cost, right? And that's what we're missing. We're missing leadership is what we're missing in this fight.
I think you've been tapping into Tom and I's phone conversation for the last couple of years. This is what we've been saying for years and years and years now, but we're not surprised you share an opinion. Real quick question here. Joe Biden has said that he'd keep a small counterterrorism force. We obviously don't know what that would look like, but what do you think the effectiveness of that would be in Afghanistan when the Taliban are running wild and taking over territory?
It's just not feasible, right? It's just not feasible. This over the horizon, small CT force, right? Everybody's enamored with Special Operations Force capabilities, which we should be enamored with them. They're amazing. I mean, they're incredibly capable. They've been keeping us safe by going after nodes in enemy networks. But if you don't have access, right? If you don't have access to the intelligence collection platforms, which includes people, human intelligence, if you don't have the bases that give you that reach, by the way, in a landlocked country, you know where you are? You're back to 1998. You're back to 1998 after Al-Qaeda had already bombed the World Trade Center for the first time in 1994, and after they attacked our embassies. You're actually arguing for the Bill Clinton counterterrorism approach toward Al-Qaeda, which was fire a few cruise missiles and call it a day, right? And so how did that work out? I mean, we should be able to learn, at least from our most recent history, that it doesn't.
Yeah, talk about failing to learn the lessons of history, right? You mentioned Libya, right? That was just the Rumsfeld strategy, basically. That was the light footprint strategy that was panned by those left of center. And it just, you see this constantly, and we're watching these ideas be recycled and being talked out as being amazing. And they're all bad ideas that we just keep recycling because we don't have the will to actually do what needs done. Right.
Well, this is an important point to make. I mean, really, Bill, it is not a partisan issue, right?
It's not. Absolutely not.
Point at which the neo-isolationists meet the right wing neo-isolationists meet the democratic retrenchers, right? And I write about this pretty extensively in Battlegrounds. Is what are the ideological origins of these movements, and really it has a lot to do with maybe those who are being captured by the new left interpretation of history, right? Who see, all of the ills of the world prior to 1945 as due to colonialism, all the ills of the world after 1945 as due to capitalist imperialism. It is a curriculum to which they've been subjected, at our universities in large measure, but has also infected, secondary and even primary school education. It is a curriculum that has at least a mild form of self-loathing, that cuts through it, right? That defines us as the problem, right? So, hey, if we're the problem, right? If it's not, it's not the jihadist terrorists, they're not the problem, right? I mean, it's us, they're only a problem because we're there. If we leave, everything will be fine, right? And so it is an approach to the world that portrays itself as more humble, right? When in fact it is profoundly arrogant, because the assumption is that only we have agency over the future, and that others, jihadist terrorists, the Kim family regime in North Korea, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, and the supreme leader in Iran, you fill in the blank. Their aspirations are only in response to us. They have no aspirations of their own, right? And think about how arrogant that is. And then also, I think you have, among the
we call that, by the way, the blame America firsters. By the way, yeah, that's what we call that.
Okay, or yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's blame America first. And hey, I'll tell you, the Shia at Ashura have nothing on us, man. I mean, we are really proficient at self-flagellation. I mean, we do a great job of it. It's figurative, but it is energetic self-flagellation. So I think I think you have this other streak that is just, hey, withdraw to our shores, right? Prioritize ourselves, and some of this sentiment is understandable. Okay, this sentiment is held by many Americans who were left behind by transitions in the global economy in the 90s and the early 2000s, right? This is a big portion of the pro Donald Trump movement, right? For example, they're dissatisfied with their government, and they see our foreign engagements as wasteful and tone deaf to their needs. And I'm talking about places like Dayton, Ohio. If you haven't seen that Frontline documentary about what happened to Dayton in this period, or any of the stories that George Packer tells in the book The Unwinding. When you read that book, it was pre-Donald Trump, but you can see the Trump movement in every page there as well, and especially the deep skepticism about economic policies, free trade, and then that carries over right into and the way the Chinese Communist Party is taking advantage of us, right? Remember Ross Perot's speech about NAFTA, and when he talked about the great sucking sound, right? about NAFTA. Hey man, he was right, but the sucking sound was to China, right? For a lot of jobs that left American companies and workers behind, So this is born of, I think, this streak of mild self-loathing, as well as the deep dissatisfaction, right? Deep dissatisfaction among certain portions of our country, and that's why it takes leadership, right? It takes leadership to talk to the American people, to improve our strategic competence, and then again explain, hey, this is what's at stake. This is why this is why it's worth the cost in Afghanistan, because hey, here's the cost of withdrawal, and again, the president made that argument, Tom and Bill. I mean, you heard that argument in August of 2017 on South Asia. But of course, he's walked back from it because a lot of the people who are advocates for American withdrawal, of course, have been in his ear on this and have been persuasive, right? You have this whole retrenchment movement that's extraordinarily well funded, right? There are these kind of pseudo think tanks popping up that really masquerade as a realist school, but they're profoundly romantic and ideological, right? Because they see disengagement as an inherent good.
Oh, they're hating on this podcast right now. Trust me, I know. We'll see some snarky nonsense after this goes up, which is fine. I don't really care. The mute button on Twitter, by the way, I don't know if you're on Twitter, General, but the mute button really is the best feature of Twitter because it doesn't give the trolls the satisfaction of blocking them, so they don't get their little screenshot saying I was blocked, and then they can play the victim card. If you just mute them, they don't know that you don't hear them. You don't really care, So it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. So there's a bunch of Taliban apologists have been muted in my feed. They think they can rail against me, and I don't even have to see them. It's great. My daughters have drugged me into Twitter and Instagram. So, I'm there now.
Yeah. I find the best button is to just not to push it. I just don't go on and check in every now and then, make a point that I want to make, and then leave. And I find to keep my sanity.
It's so toxic, you guys. I mean, it really, and our enemies use it. Our enemies use it, right? What was the number one policy, point of policy advocacy for the Internet Research Agency by the Russians, right? So, of course, the main emphasis was on dividing us, right? Reducing our confidence in who we are as a people, pitting us against each other on issues of race. They had a lot of 9/11 trutherism, right? A lot of 9/11 trutherism. Right. Yeah, a lot of that. But then also it was advocacy for America's withdrawal from the Middle East and withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that's what the Russian intelligence agencies were pushing and trying to magnify, this mantra of ending endless wars. And because they would love to see us withdraw because they see it as an opportunity to fill the void once America disengages.
Well, here's another issue for you, General. This is sort of I think is a question that's rooted in your own work, including dereliction of duty. So you just made the case for an ongoing commitment to Afghanistan. The problem is we don't hear anybody else making the ongoing case for commitment to Afghanistan. Certainly nobody in the U.S. military leadership. People don't realize that the U.S. military has had basically 7 out of 10 toes out of Afghanistan for a long time now. They haven't really wanted to be there, I don't see any, generals or anybody else saying, hey, we have an interest in preventing the Taliban and Al Qaeda from recapturing all of Afghanistan or much of it. I don't see anybody making that argument anywhere. And so, it's part of what I say about all this is that, I could see the argument, but other than you and maybe a handful of other people here and there, I don't really see anybody else making it. What's your thoughts on that in terms of, do you see a failure in leadership now in terms of America and protecting Americans and American interests?
Yeah, hey Tom, I do, and I think that when it comes to matters of life and death, we have to speak the truth. Like we have to stick to facts and analysis. And I think what happens is there's so much momentum gathers behind the drive to end endless wars, and it sounds great, right? And there is the whole associated narrative of war weariness, and hey, I didn't grow weary, fighting for across these years, and our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines haven't either. And it's interesting that when during this period of time before the president made the decision on South Asia, I thought it was really important to give him access to different perspectives. President Trump is somebody, he's a real estate developer, and he used to like to walk around and talk to workers within his properties and so forth, and get a sense from on the ground what's happening. So, I called up General Dunford, and he was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I said, hey, can you just get some of our soldiers, non-commissioned officers, junior officers, who know Afghanistan well, have been there for multiple times, to just come over to the White House and just have a unstructured conversation with the president, and the vice president was there initially, and so they came over. We did it in the Roosevelt Room. It was covered. It's all in the press. And the substance of the conversation wasn't really covered very well. And at one point, the president asked soldiers, he goes, "Hey, aren't you like tired of being there? And don't you just want to stop going over there all the time and fighting in Afghanistan?" And a sergeant looked at the president straight in the eye and he said, "You know what? I want to go back. I can't wait to get back. And the reason I want to get back is because I want to finish this job so that my son or grandson doesn't have to come back here, right?" And because he realized that unless we defeat these enemies, in this case, that means to convincing the Taliban they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. It also entails hardening and strengthening Afghanistan against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which lies mainly across the border in Pakistan. But this sergeant who's spent at least a third of his time, for many years in Afghanistan, asked the president to allow them to fight more effectively, and to complete their mission so that their children or grandchildren didn't have to go back. I think that's sadly the situation we're in now, is that we're going to have to, we're going to have to go back at some point at a much higher cost. And again, this isn't a theoretical case either. What happened in December 2011 after Vice President Biden said, "Thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war in Iraq," right? Is that then we have the rise of ISIS and then a much more costly campaign against ISIS than it would have cost to sustain not just our military but our diplomatic efforts in Iraq.
Before we move on from Afghanistan, because I just want to ask you a little bit about great power competition, some of the other points in your book, and that. One of the issues that has been the most triggering throughout the career for Bill and myself in terms of our writing is when we expose basic facts about the Taliban's ongoing alliance with Al Qaeda, and there are an awful lot of people that have wanted to downplay that or dismiss that through the years. And obviously the whole U.S. deal with the Taliban, which was signed in February of this year, enshrined these so-called counterterrorism assurances for the Taliban. We've been very critical of that because there are no enforcement or verification mechanisms. There's no evidence that the Taliban has done anything, taken any action against al-Qaeda anywhere in the country. Meanwhile, the Afghan government, our punitive ally, who we seem to be wanting to leave behind, has been fighting al-Qaeda in various places. They just killed Osama Abdul Rauf, who was the media chief for al-Qaeda, in a Taliban-controlled village. Nearly 8 months after the State Department signed off on the Taliban's supposed counterterrorism assurances. I was just wondering, throughout your time, you were at the pinnacle of the U.S. government, your national security advisor. What do you make of this? Did you see any evidence that the Taliban was willing to betray al-Qaeda or wasn't? You must have come across this sort of paradigm for understanding the Taliban, which plays, you and I have talked about this, I call it disconnect the dots, right? There's this game that people play where they want to see America out of Afghanistan, and the way they see out of that is by defining the Taliban as something other than Al-Qaeda's ally. So that if we do that, if we define the Taliban down and play disconnect the dots, that in their minds justifies the whole thing, basically leaving.
Yeah. Right. Well, if you don't like the enemy you have, just invent a new one. Right. That's what we've done.
Right.
I mean, it's complete self delusion. I mean, the first time that I asked for a paper on a South Asia strategy, I wrote across the top of it, "Did we outsource this to the Taliban?" And what had occurred, I think, in departments and agencies across our government is kind of a strange form of Stockholm syndrome, where they bought into this a whole false narrative, that, gosh, in 2001 we really missed a great opportunity, for a peace agreement or power sharing agreement with the Taliban. Hey, what we really need to do is enter into power sharing with them, because they're a legitimate entity within Afghanistan. Well, maybe a legitimate entity for about 5% of the population. But what we've done is we've partnered with that 5% against the 95% of the population, and empowered them in a way that they could only dream of themselves. We've talked about this before. I mean, my point of view over the last couple of years is, hey, if it's our goal just to leave, just leave. Don't empower the Taliban on your way out. And hey, what does power sharing with the Taliban look like? I mean, that's mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday, I guess. Is that every other girls' school is bulldozed? Maybe only every other maternity hospital is attacked. With the Taliban killing infants and pregnant mothers. I mean, this is who we're talking about here. Not a group that's going to now impose some benevolent or mild form of Sharia, right? I mean, this is a group that is determined to extinguish freedoms and any human rights inside of Afghanistan.
Well, the argument you say we were exposed to, that there was some political reconciliation, that was achievable in 2001, 2002. That the evidence for that is really non-existent. I mean, it's based on a few very dubious sources. I mean, you can debunk that pretty easily. And I mean, the truth of the matter is that those people have to ignore what Mullah Omar said, the head of the Taliban. You have to ignore what the actual decision makers in the Taliban have said consistently throughout the whole years, and study their behavior. And you talked about political goals earlier. The Taliban has been consistent in their number one political goal, which is the reinstitution, the resurrection of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They have a clear political goal. And, basically before we recorded this podcast, you could see even in recent days, the Taliban spokesman, recorded an interview in which he said, yeah, the Islamic Emirate is what we're all about. I mean, they've made this over and over again. They've made this clear. Now, I got to ask you a question, and maybe this is a little inside baseball for the administration you served in, but this is where Bill and I sort of, and we agree, we've argued too, that if we want to just get out. You don't have to empower the Taliban. But, again, here, just speaking to failures of American leadership, I've seen senior American officials basically pretend that the Taliban has a political goal other than resurrecting the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Listen, General Mattis, when he was Secretary of Defense, he looked at a statement that was put out by Habatullah Akhundzada, the Emir of the Taliban, and he said that Habatullah laid out a clear peace plan for Afghanistan. Bill and I looked at that statement, which they translated in English for us, so we didn't even have to get a Pashtun translator. We could translate from Arabic if we had to ourselves, but we couldn't. We didn't even have to translate it. They put it out in English. There was no hint in that statement of a peace plan, none. It was just basically preparing for victory. And I guess that's sort of the problem we face in all this, right? Is that if the American leadership just basically refuses to identify the Taliban's political goals and understand what they're about in Afghanistan, then basically, the game's up, right?
Yeah, this is a story for another day, maybe one day. But it was much harder than it had to be to redesignate the Taliban as an enemy force. Right, that should have been done, I think, on the day after President Trump was sworn in 2017, and that resistance came from the departments and agencies. It didn't come from the president, and now I'll just stop there. But I think what happened is it was a brazen case of self delusion. And what's so disappointing is it's all come back, right? All those flawed assumptions about the nature of the enemy have all been resurrected, even with, just the most egregious actions of the enemy ongoing, like just within the last 24 hours, right? And we're still in denial about it. And what really bothers me is, we have I think a lot of non-governmental organizations, advocacy groups that care deeply about human rights. Where are they? Why aren't they loudly condemning, this so-called peace agreement with the Taliban? I just think that I guess when the perpetrators of the violations of human rights, are an egregious enemy like the Taliban, they get a free ride. I don't understand. Are they just misunderstood, people who ought to be, welcomed into a power sharing agreements? It is absolutely, for me, impossible to understand.
Tom and I joke about this, but every time we say it, it's less of a joke. I think all of the Taliban revisionist historians and apologists, those who have pushed this peace deal, should be forced to live in Kabul so they could witness the pleasures of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and for firsthand.
Right. And again, guys, obviously it's not a theoretical case, right? I mean, they ruled Afghanistan from 96 to 2001 and made it a living hell, right? And so it's just, again, this goes back to what we've been discussing is our inability to learn even from our most recent historical experience.
Do you see a way around this? Like, how do we overcome this?
I think it's education. And to help the American people understand better the nature of the challenges we're facing. This is the whole purpose of writing Battlegrounds, right? Is because I think the only way out of this is that the American people have to demand a better foreign policy. We have to demand it because it's certainly not happening naturally. It's undercut, by retrenchment movement as well as the neo-isolationist movement. It goes across both political parties. I think that we are bound, now for a period of introspection after the triple crisis of, the pandemic and the recession and the social and racial divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the protests and violence after. And the vitriolic partisan season that we are still in the midst of, right? I mean, we're going to have a period of introspection, but of course, the point I'm trying to make in Battlegrounds is, none of these challenges are going away. They're not going to go away. And if we learn anything from COVID, we should learn that threats to us that develop overseas can only be dealt with at an exorbitant price once they reach our shores, right? It's much better, obviously, in the case of a pandemic, to contain it close to its origins before it gets here, right? And I think the same can be said of jihadist terrorist organizations who want to commit mass murder against us.
So let's get into a little bit about COVID in the era. I mean, we've already taken up a lot of your time, but I knew Afghanistan was going to take up a lot of time, and again, there's all sorts of triggering going on. But when it comes to your time as national security advisor, you tried to shepherd the government. Obviously, there are already currents in the Defense Department, State Department, elsewhere to focus on great power competition, the rising challenges of China and Russia. You deal with this quite a bit in Battlegrounds. And sort of how those approach national security threats and threats to our interests around the globe. And maybe talk a little bit about sort of the situation you found yourself in 2017, where it's the post 9/11 era was dominated by, Afghanistan and then Iraq and sort of the efforts to fight the jihadis. And now you find yourself in 2017, basically, the U.S. had already largely pivot away from large-scale counterinsurgency against the jihadis. That game was basically already over. But you still had an ongoing commitment to contain or to disrupt the jihadis, but you had to worry about these bigger sort of rivals now, near-peer competitors. Maybe talk a little about the balancing act you found yourself in.
Yeah, what I found is that we definitely needed to administer a corrective to the assumptions that that great power competition was a relic of the past, and to compete more effectively with both China and Russia. But what I didn't maybe fully anticipate is the degree to which some people would seize on this as kind of an emotional cathartic to leave behind the frustrations of the wars that we were already engaged in, and to try to just say, okay, well, this is a reason to disengage from ongoing conflicts that are high stakes as well, right? And I think if you are a great power like the United States and do have global interests, when your security is at threat, you have to be able to do more than one thing at a time. And our troop commitments, as you mentioned, Tom, have gone down to very small numbers. In Iraq and Syria, as in that case. Across Africa, mainly with Al-Shabaab, but also a very small contingent in the Sahel region of Africa, mainly enabling coalition partners in the French in particular, and then of course in Afghanistan. These numbers are minuscule compared to historical levels of commitment in those areas, but just abroad generally. I think most Americans would be surprised that our armed forces have fewer soldiers positioned overseas today than we have had at any time since the end of World War II. Right. So anyway, it was a sustainable level. But there were those who were making the argument that, hey, well, for us to compete with China, we have to get completely out of the Middle East. Actually, the Middle East is an arena of competition that is important to our security, but it also is an arena of competition in the area of great power competition as well, right? And what you do when you say I'm disengaging from a place is you are able enable others to fill really what is a psychological void. So by continuing to say, hey, we're leaving the Middle East, we're leaving the Middle East, we're leaving the Middle East, or we're leaving Afghanistan. What that's done is it created an opportunity for Putin to pursue his goal of restoring Russia to national greatness by really playing the role both of arsonist and fireman in the Middle East, by enabling Assad's serial episodes of mass homicide that are the Syrian civil war, and then to portray himself to Gulf states and to the Israelis as, hey, just work with me. Let's guarantee Assad in power in a post-civil war Syria, guarantee Russian interests here, and I'll work overtime to diminish Iranian interests. Well, it's a big lie, right? It's a lie because Assad is more reliant on the Iranians than he is on the Russians. And lying, and the other reason is lying is just what Putin does all the time, right? He just doesn't, he never tells the truth anyway. And so, but he gets away with it. He gets away with it because we just keep saying, hey, we're leaving. And actually, we don't even leave. We just keep saying it, right? So we are still engaged to a certain extent anyway with the Syrian Defense Forces in eastern Syria, an important mission in connection with ensuring the enduring defeat of ISIS, but also to hold on to territory that really comprises about 60 to 70% of Syria's oil reserves that guess who needs? Russia, and Assad and the Iranians to reconstruct the country that they helped to destroy, right? So we shouldn't give that to them because you know what that is? That's political leverage. It's also terrain that helps impede the Iranians' effort to establish a land bridge, to the Mediterranean, and our efforts are important in Iraq as well because we want an Iraq that is stable and not aligned with Iran, and our presence there gives us a degree of influence, and it also gives some Iraqis who also don't want Iraq aligned with Iran, which is the vast majority. It gives them the ability to say no to the Iranians on certain topics. And, talk about a hard job to have. How'd you like to be Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the prime minister of Iraq? It's a pretty bleak situation. But by disengaging, this is, again, another example of a situation that gets worse. It gets worse in connection with empowering Iran across the region, and gets worse in connection with not being able to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. So you're going to get what then would be Al-Qaeda 3.0, Al-Qaeda in Iraq 3.0, whatever the next version is going to be after ISIS. So again, it's a relatively small commitment in military commitment as well as in cost, right? In financial cost, and of course it's when you consider the cost of disengagement, it looks like kind of a form of an insurance policy as well.
Yeah, we're here with General McMaster, who's been very gracious with his time on this episode of the podcast here. He's talking about his new book, Battlegrounds, and his time as National Security Advisor for President Trump. Bill, you have anything else on Iraq or Syria before we ask just a couple other short questions on great power competition, some of the other things in his book?
Well, I do. I have a lot of questions, Tom, but we
got to narrow them down. I know.
So let's go on ahead. Let's go ahead.
So, General, one of the things in your book that I was very I found impressive was the intellectual honesty on how difficult some of these foreign policy challenges are, and that you don't actually necessarily know the answer. And one of them was on North Korea, and you have language in there. It was fascinating to me because listen. We're involved in some of these debates in Washington, even though neither one of us are based in Washington. We're involved in some of these debates. And it's interesting how often people are like, oh, I know all the answers and you just need to do this or that. and everything's gonna be fine, and I'm looking at the world and I'm thinking, I don't know what the hell to do in a lot of cases, I really don't, I try and be, policy agnostic as often as I can, just trying to figure out what's going on, and you can tell that we have mixed thoughts about a lot of things, mixed feelings about a lot of things. But when it comes to North Korea, it was very interesting to me. You said that you were testing a theory, and you called it a theory that that Kim could be convinced to give up his nuclear development program, his nuclear arms program, through sort of this maximum pressure campaign. You didn't say you knew that it could be done. You didn't say that you knew that there was a way to do this or that there was some easy set of policy solutions. I just was curious. When I read that, I just was struck because so often that sort of, I think, reservation or that note of uncertainty is missing in our policy debates across the board. And I was wondering if you had any other sort of thoughts along those lines, or where you see North Korea now going forward.
Well, hey, thanks. This is a really important, I think, aspect of policymaking and teeing up options, for the president, is to be realistic about it, right? I mean, you can't fall into this trap of optimism bias, right? That's a cognitive trap that's easy to fall into, or confirmation bias, right? You have to, as I mentioned, really be clear about the assumptions that you're making and make those assumptions explicit and continuously test those assumptions, right? If you're going to be honest. And so with North Korea, we made some assumptions. We made some assumptions about what they want with the nuclear weapons, right? This is an important assumption. A lot of people mirror image, North Korea, and without recognizing the unique nature of the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world, right? And
Christopher Hitchens used to call it a necrocracy. I think I'm probably butchering that, but basically because it was, the idea was that the grandfather or the father, I think, is still technically the head of state or something like that in North Korea, even though he's been dead for years. So it's this weird thing where the Walking Dead are sort of technically still the rulers of North Korea.
And they've come up with this kind of seems like a wacky ideology, but I mean if you're subjected to generations of brainwashing, you start to buy into it, and that ideology is Juche ideology, which is essentially an ideology of racial purity and superiority, in which the deprivation of the North Korean people is actually a sign of their superiority, right? And their good fortune, I guess, as well. But it sounds crazy, but it is it's taken hold in the North, and Kim is driven. Kim Jong-un now is driven by a fear of losing the control. And also he's driven by the aspiration of unifying the peninsula under the red banner. And so when we look at North Korea, a lot of people say, they just wanted to deter us. Well, I mean, I don't think so, right? Every act of aggression on the peninsula since June of 1950, when North Korea attacked, has been initiated by the North. And by the way, the North has tremendous deterrent capability, conventional deterrent capability, because of all the artillery tubes and rockets that are within the range of Seoul. So what does it need nuclear weapons for? I think it needs nuclear weapons for extortion, to extort us, off the peninsula as the first step in unifying the peninsula under the red banner. And I think also, it's important to recognize, North Korea has never met a weapon it didn't try to sell to somebody, including their nuclear weapons program to Syria until the Israeli Defense Force bombed it in 2007. So what we said, okay, accept North Korea's nuclear power and deterring it. That's not an option, right? I mean, I don't think that's an option for us. Others would say, well, let's repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts. Well, I don't think that makes sense either, right? That's paying off the North right away with the relaxation of sanctions, huge monetary payoffs and incentives just for the privilege of talking to them. And then what the North Koreans do is that they string out the negotiations. It's a bottom-up, frustrating, often so sometimes multinational process, right? That delivers a weak agreement after we give concession after concession, and then North Korea immediately
sounds like the Taliban, by the way. Sounds like the Taliban talks in Doha.
It's what we do with the Taliban too.
Yeah.
That's what it's what diplomats do, right? They get diplomatic agreements, and what happens is they mask and define political catastrophes as diplomatic triumphs, right? I mean it's crazy. That's what the Iran nuclear deal was as well. So I just think that we have to test the thesis that we can convince Kim Jong-un that he's safer with without the weapons than he is with the weapons. And that's a maximum pressure campaign that involves economic sanctions, but it's also diplomatic and it's military. I mean, this is what really I think is poorly understood these days, is that strategic competence is about the integration of all elements of national power, not the use of elements of national power disconnected from one another. Right? That's what we did in Afghanistan for all these years. Right? What we were doing militarily, it really did nothing to advance the diplomatic process. In fact, it cut against it, right, by not having the Taliban as a designated enemy, by giving them a free ride during negotiations. It's the same thing, I think, in connection with North Korea. The North Korean regime, I think for a time, Kim was convinced that we were preparing to impose denuclearization on the North without his cooperation. Well, that's good, because what that does is it provides an incentive, for him to consider the fact that he may be safer without them than he is with them. So anyway, I think that's the argument in the book. I hope that whoever comes in doesn't just go back to the same cycle, although I think that's probably what's going to happen. I mean, the biggest critiques, are funny. I mean, they came from the people, the exact same people that had experienced the failures of the past, saying, "Hey, how come you're not doing what we did?" Well, because it failed. That's why.
Yeah, I mean, the other argument I see, I've written only occasionally about this, but the other argument I see is, and you write about this in the book, so it's good to address it here, is, well, just let the South Koreans lead the way, basically let them do what they want to do, and whatever their policy desires are, because they're the ones that have to deal with it, and it's not really our issue anyway. We're sort of secondary to this. And you write a little bit about the South Korean sunshine policy in the past and how that didn't work. And I know you've developed good relationships with South Korean officials, and I was wondering if you had any insights on terms of their thinking now, where this goes forward. Because just like with the strategy with Afghanistan, where there was a strategy announced in August of 2017 and then sort of abandoned more than 1 year later, the maximum pressure campaign against North Korea, I think it's very dubious that that's going to continue in any sort of holistic way at all. Maybe components of it, but probably not. But be that as it may, what do you think the South Koreans are thinking about this going forward now?
Yeah. Well, of course, they're watching developments in the North really closely. It's really hard to see, even from the vantage point of South Korea, just below the 30th parallel, what's going on in the North with the Kim family regime. And his behavior, it's always been erratic, but it's been pretty erratic, in recent months. The blowing up of the building that was meant to be the coordination center between North and South, but then apologizing for killing and then burning the body of a South Korean official who got lost kind of on the coast of North Korea, and then recently the shedding of tears during the address he gave at the military parade, and the guys disappeared for 2-3 week periods, which is kind of unprecedented. There's rumors of binge buying in the North, and I guess if you believe the regime, there has not even been one case of COVID-19, which of course is not true. So I think it's a period of instability in the North. It's a period of instability, I think, that is heightened by the transition of leadership in the U.S., because typically what the regime does is it welcomes a new administration with a series of provocations to try to get back to the failed pattern of previous efforts, right? To get back to getting the payoff from that. And so I think that it's important that the South and us stay as aligned as we can. Moon Jae-in and his party, they are a left-leaning party that has been sort of susceptible to this approach of the sunshine policy. His professed love, like President Trump's, I guess, of Kim Jong-un has gone unrequited. And I guess the question is, how often do you, as you're going in for the big kiss, and you get slapped in the face, how long does it take you to realize, maybe you need to take another approach, right? So I think that it is a very dynamic time. What I would like to see is whoever comes into office, if it's the Biden administration, that they do continue the campaign of maximum pressure. We have not ever tested the thesis. Those unprecedented sanctions, thanks to Nikki Haley, which she did, incredible work to get through the UN Security Council. They've never been fully implemented or enforced, and this could really put a big constraint on the North. I mean, there's a reason why North Korea is the most active in the area of cybercrime and ransomware, is because now that's their main source of income, right? They've been shut down in a lot of key areas, coal exports, for example, other import controls. If China were to enforce them, could have a very significant effect. I think, for example, under Article 2 of the Constitution, the president could order the interdiction of vessels that are circumventing UN Security Council resolutions, and we could probably do that in a multinational format. I think certainly the Japanese would be up for it. We're going to try to get the South Koreans up for it, and maybe the British and the French and Australians and others, working together, and invite the Chinese. Hey, help us out. See what they say. But I think, if China isn't enforcing the sanctions, that how about secondary sanctions on Chinese banks? How about that? I think there's a lot. There's a lot that could be done to continue to test the thesis that has been left undone. And then, of course, I think it's going to be very important to try to heal the rift in the family between South Korea and Japan as well. And I think with Prime Minister Suga coming in, Prime Minister Abe, I love the guy. He was great. His whole government, we worked so well together with them. We would get together, there'd be nothing to talk about. Because we're so aligned on these issues. But of course, Prime Minister Abe, because of his father was and so forth, he came with some baggage on the South Korea relationship. So I'm hoping that Prime Minister Suga and President Moon will get together and will bury the hatchet, recognize that they have to work together in the future, not just on the North Korea threat, but the China threat, right? What China wants to do is they want to co-opt South Korea, right in battlegrounds about how China pursues a strategy of co-option, coercion, and concealment. They are all over South Korea in this by trying to make South Korea dependent on them economically, then using that dependence for coercive power over South Korea. And to really force us off the peninsula as the first step in isolating their main regional competitor, which is Japan, right? So, I think that we have to think a few moves ahead on all this and recognize what China's trying to do, how that relates to how China is dealing with South Korea, and continue to test this thesis, that Kim Jong-un could be convinced that he is less safe with the weapons than he is without them.
There's another passage in Battlegrounds where you say, convince also the Chinese and Russians that North Korea's nuclear program is not in their interest. It's not in the Chinese and Russians' interest to do that. And that gets to a point that requires sort of this integrated strategic thinking when it comes to cuts across all the different layers of the national security strategy that you shepherded in the Trump administration, which is that there is a tie-in between the so-called great power competition and the rogue state actors. And you have to understand those tie-ins if you're going to try and deal with the complex challenges that face us going forward here. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on, how the Chinese and Russians are going to move forward here now. There's growing evidence that they have a partnership, obviously, between China and Russia. The great theory of relations was this idea that going back to the Nixon administration, that you could basically play China off on the Soviet Union. There's a competing theory that the Chinese played us off the Soviet Union, and basically extracted a lot of benefits from that over the years. But today, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are, best buddies. If you read the diplomatic traffic as we do, what are your thoughts on where that goes in terms of how they see not just North Korea, but other issues going forward, the challenges for American power and interests and our allies and partnerships around the globe?
I think we had some initial success in convincing China that a nuclear armed North Korea was not in their interest. And remember, this was at a time when Kim Jong-un was estranged from everyone, including and maybe even especially Xi Jinping. And then, of course, the reason it's not in China's interest is because of the breakdown in the non-proliferation regime, in Asia, in a way that could be a threat to China. I think conversations have to start, which probably likely start in Japan about, hey, do we need a nuclear deterrent, separate from the American nuclear umbrella? South Korea, people forget years ago, had initiated a nuclear weapons program until the United States said, hey, what the hell are you guys doing? Don't do that. Right? China should do the same thing with the North, actually. But what China does is they view North Korea as part of their U.S. strategy. And that's a strategy to push us out of the Indo-Pacific region and establish exclusionary areas of primacy, and and create servile relationships with countries in the region that replicate the tributary system of Chinese empires, right? And that's what really what they want to do. It sounds Dr. Evil-esque, right? But it's exactly what they want to do. And so what we have to do is convince China that the threat from the breakdown of the non-proliferation regime outweighs their concerns about losing the buffer state in the north. I think there are ways to do that. There are ways to convince China maybe to behave differently, but we also have to recognize that they may not do it, right? And it might take secondary sanctions on Chinese banks, which could have a really devastating effect, I think, on China at this time. Even as Wall Street is rushing to pour U.S. investor money into China and to help them pursue their designs against us. I mean, it's really a sad situation. So, I think that the competition with China does overlap with these other competitions, certainly, and they are interconnected. To get to your point about Cold War diplomacy and really what was called triangular diplomacy at the time, pioneered by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and that was the idea that we would have a closer relationship each with China and with then the Soviet Union than they had with each other, right? And this would prevent any single power or authoritarian entity from gaining control of the Eurasian landmass. This goes back to geostrategic thinking of Mackinder and Spikeman, and that was that made sense, right? That made sense, but it's infeasible now. It's infeasible because of the degree to which Xi Jinping has consolidated power of the Chinese Communist Party and the ideology that drives him and the aspirations that drive him, and it's impossible based on Vladimir Putin, and his desire to drag us all down, right? China has a grandiose strategies, that they're employing against us, under coercion, and concealment. This includes military civil fusion, made in China 2025, the One Belt, One Road, and they're very ambitious and aggressive internationally, economically, as well as from a military perspective in the Indo-Pacific region in particular. But then Russia doesn't have the resources. They know they don't have the resources. So what they want to do is they want to drag us down, right? Putin's theory of victory is to be the last man standing, as he wages a sustained campaign of what I call the battlegrounds, again, some more alliteration, of disruption, disinformation, and denial, right? And what he wants to do, as we were talking about earlier, is divide us, weaken our confidence in who we are, and pit us against each other.
Well, General, thank you very much for joining us. It's been our pleasure to have H.R. McMaster on the podcast this week. Our listeners will greatly enjoy this. We kept you for an hour and a half. That's plenty. It's too much time of your time, but we really appreciate it. We have at least an hour and a half of additional conversation we could record if we could. But thank you again for joining us, General. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much, Bill. Thanks, Tom. Great to be with both of you guys, and thanks for the great work that you do on this podcast and with the Long War Journal.
And thank you to our audience for listening again to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Again, this has been H.R. McMaster on our 32nd episode already, Bill. That's pretty good. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. And we will see you again next week.